The ancient bones jutting from the dried lakebed weren't supposed to be there. But as Mayor Patricia Kellerman stared at the massive skull emerging from the cracked earth, rows of teeth like railroad spikes gleaming in the moonlight, she realized. Her decades of keeping people away from Blackwater Lake had nothing to do with fishing regulations. The creature's empty sockets seemed to watch her, and somewhere in the darkness behind her, something large shifted in the water that shouldn't exist anymore. She'd spent 30 years protecting the town from the truth, but now the lake was receding, and the dead were rising. The fine she'd given Jake Morrison for fishing on his own land was the least of her problems now. Jake Morrison's boots crunched against the frost-covered dock as he carried his tackle box toward the water's edge. The October morning air bit at his cheeks, but Blackwater Lake stretched before him like black glass, promising the kind of peace he hadn't felt since Sarah's funeral 6 months ago. His grandfather had built this dock with his own hands back in 1952, and Jake had spent countless summers here, learning to cast a line and listening to the old man's stories about the lake's history. The property had been in the Morrison family for 4 generations. 67 acres of prime lakefront, with the main house sitting on a hill overlooking the water. After Sarah's death, Jake had retreated here from the city, needing the solitude to process his grief. The lake had always been his sanctuary. He was setting up his rod when the sound of tires on gravel interrupted the morning stillness. A white Ford Explorer with the Millbrook Township logo pulled up to the house, and Jake's jaw tightened as he recognized the woman stepping out. Mayor Patricia Kellerman had been a fixture in Millbrook for as long as Jake could remember. Tall and severe, with steel grey hair pulled back in a perpetual bun, she moved with the rigid authority of someone who'd spent decades telling others what they could and couldn't do. At 62, she'd been mayor for nearly 30 years, and her word was law in the small Pennsylvania town. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying across the water with the sharp crack of a whip. "Step away from the water immediately." Jake set down his rod and turned to face her, his hands clenched at his sides. "Morning, Patricia. Beautiful day for fishing." "It's Mayor Kellerman," she corrected, pulling a clipboard from her SUV. "And you're in violation of Township Ordinance 47B, fishing is prohibited on Blackwater Lake." "On my own property?" Jake's voice rose with disbelief. "My family has owned this land since before you were born." Patricia's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile on anyone else but looked more like a wound on her gaunt face. "Property lines end at the waterline, Mr. Morrison. The lake itself falls under township jurisdiction. Has since 1987. That's horseshit, and you know it." Jake took a step toward her. "My grandfather fished this lake. My father fished this lake. I've been fishing here since I was 8 years old." "Then you've been breaking the law for quite some time." Patricia scribbled something on her clipboard with the mechanical precision of a typewriter. "The fine is $500 for the first offense." $500, Jake stopped himself, taking a deep breath. Sarah had always told him his temper would get him in trouble someday. "Show me the ordinance." Patricia tore off a yellow carbon copy and handed it to him. "It's all there in black and white. Fishing prohibited due to environmental concerns and public safety." Jake scanned the document, his anger building with each line. "Environmental concerns. This lake has some of the cleanest water in the state. And public safety. It's on my private property. The lake has been classified as a protected waterway since 1987, Patricia repeated, her voice carrying the weary patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. The township conducted extensive environmental studies and determined that fishing activities posed a significant threat to the ecosystem. "What studies?" Jake crumpled the citation in his fist. "I never heard about any studies. The records are available for public inspection during normal business hours." Patricia clicked her pen shut and tucked it into her jacket pocket. "You have 30 days to pay the fine, Mr. Morrison. Any further violations will result in increased penalties and possible legal action." Jake stared at the crumpled paper in his hand, then at the pristine lake stretching out behind him. "Why, Patricia? Why are you doing this?" For just a moment, something flickered across the mayor's face, a shadow of what might have been fear or regret. But it was gone so quickly Jake wondered if he'd imagined it. "I'm doing my job," she said simply. Protecting the citizens of Millbrook. From what? A man fishing on his own property. Patricia walked back to her SUV without answering. She paused, with her hand on the door handle, looking back at Jake with an expression he couldn't read. Some things are better left undisturbed, Mr. Morrison. Your grandfather understood that. What the hell is that supposed to mean? But Patricia was already climbing into her vehicle. The engine started with a mechanical growl and she backed out of the driveway without another word, leaving Jake standing on his dock with $500 worth of questions and no answers. He stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the citation in his hand. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the water surface. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called out, a haunting sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding hills. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his lawyer buddy, Tom Chen, who lived in Philadelphia. Hey man, how's the hermit life treating you? Still planning to make it to the reunion next month? Jake typed back, need a favor. Can you research Township Ordinance 47B from Millbrook? Something about fishing prohibition on Blackwater Lake. The response came back almost immediately, sure thing. Everything okay up there? Jake looked out at the lake, its surface so still. It could have been a sheet of black ice. Not sure yet. He folded the citation and stuffed it into his jacket pocket, then gathered up his fishing gear. As he walked back toward the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not just with the ordinance, though that was bad enough, but with the whole situation. Patricia had been different today. More nervous than usual, glancing at the water as if she expected something to surface. And that comment about his grandfather, what had she meant by that? Jake's grandfather, William Morrison, had died when Jake was 16. A quiet man who'd worked as a carpenter and spent his free time on the lake. He'd taught Jake everything. He knew about fishing, but he'd also been oddly protective of certain areas of the water. There were places he'd never let Jake fish, spots where he'd grow quiet and steer the boat away without explanation. Some parts of the lake don't like to be disturbed, he'd said once when Jake had pressed him about it. Best to leave them be. Jake had thought it was just old-fashioned superstition. Now he wondered if there was more to it. He climbed the steps to the wraparound porch and let himself into the house. The place still felt too big and too empty without Sarah, but it was starting to feel like home again. The main room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the lake, and Jake had spent countless hours sitting in his grandfather's old recliner, watching the water change colors with the shifting light. He made himself a cup of coffee and settled into the chair with his laptop, determined to do some research of his own. The Millbrook Township website was about what he'd expected: basic information about services, a few photos of the annual fall festival, and a contact form that probably hadn't been updated since 2005. But when he clicked on the ordinances section, he found something interesting. Township Ordinance 47B was listed, all right, but when he clicked on the link, he got an error message, document not found. Jake tried several more times with the same result. He searched for Blackwater Lake and got a single result, a brief mention in a 1987 township meeting minutes that had been poorly scanned and was mostly illegible. He was about to give up when his phone rang. Tom Chen's number. Jake, I've got some weird news about that ordinance you asked me to research. Let me guess, you can't find it either. Oh, I found it. But here's the thing, it was never officially ratified by the Township Council. According to the state records, the ordinance was proposed in 1987 but never came up for a vote. Jake sat up straighter. What does that mean? It means the ordinance doesn't exist. At least not legally. Someone's been enforcing a law that was never actually passed. Jake stared out at the lake, his mind racing. Tom, I need you to do something else for me. Can you research the environmental studies that were supposedly done on Blackwater Lake in 1987? Sure, but Jake, if this ordinance is bogus, you could sue the township for harassment. That fine they gave you is completely illegal. Let me think about it, Jake said. Just find out what you can about those studies. After he hung up, Jake sat in the growing darkness, watching the last light fade from the sky. The lake had turned black, living up to its name, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the clear autumn sky. Something was wrong in Millbrook. Something that went back nearly 40 years, to 1987. The year his grandfather had stopped talking about the old days, the year he'd become protective of certain parts of the lake. Jake made a decision. Tomorrow, he was going fishing. Citation or no citation, legal or ill. Jake woke before dawn, his dreams filled with dark water and distant singing. The house felt colder than usual, and when he checked the thermostat, he found the temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight. Outside, frost covered the windows. Like crystalline spider webs, and the lake lay perfectly still under a grey sky. He made coffee and toast, then gathered his fishing gear with deliberate precision. If Patricia Kellerman wanted to play games, he'd give her something to really worry about. The citation sat on his kitchen table where he'd left it, a yellow reminder of laws that apparently didn't exist. Tom Chen had called again the night before, with more disturbing news. Not only had the environmental studies never been conducted, but there was no record of any township meetings in 1987 that discussed Blackwater Lake. The official minutes had gaps, entire months missing from the public record, as if someone had deliberately removed them. It's like they erased a whole year, Tom had said. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of legal practice. Jake pulled on his heaviest jacket and headed for the dock. The morning air was sharp enough to cut, and his breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air. As he walked down the hill, he noticed something that made him stop. The water level was lower than he'd ever seen it. Much lower. The dock that had been built at water level now extended nearly 3 feet over exposed lakebed, and dark stones jutted up from the shallow water like broken teeth. Jake had lived by this lake his entire childhood, and he'd never seen it this low. Even during the drought of 1999, the water had only dropped a few inches. This was different. This was wrong. He set up his rod anyway, casting from the end of the dock toward the deeper water in the center of the lake. The bait hit the surface with a soft plop, and ripples spread outward in perfect concentric circles. Jake settled into the folding chair he'd brought and waited. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no sounds of life from the surrounding forest. Even the wind had died, leaving the air still and heavy. Jake had fished in quiet places before, but this felt different. This felt empty. He was reeling in his line to check the bait when he heard the car. Another township vehicle, this one a patrol car with Deputy Rick Hoffman behind the wheel. Rick was a good guy. Jake had known him since high school, but he wore the uncomfortable expression of someone who'd been ordered to do something he didn't want to do. Morning, Jake, Rick called out as he approached the dock. Beautiful day for, he stopped, clearly realizing the irony of his words. Morning, Rick. Jake continued reeling in his line. Come to arrest me for fishing on my own property. Rick's face reddened. You know I don't want to be here, but the mayor was very specific. Any further violations and I'm supposed to confiscate your equipment. What violations? Jake held up the citation. This ordinance doesn't exist, Rick. My lawyer checked. It was never ratified by the council. I don't know anything about that. Rick shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable. I just follow orders. Since when do you follow Patricia Kellerman's orders? You work for the county, not the township. She's got some kind of special authority, Rick said. Something about environmental protection. Look, Jake, just put the rod down and we can all go home. Jake studied his old friend's face. Rick was nervous, more nervous than the situation warranted. His eyes kept darting to the water, as if he was afraid something might surface. What's really going on here, Rick? What happened in 1987? I don't know what you're talking about. You were living here in 1987. You were what, 19? 20? You must remember something. Rick's jaw tightened. I remember it was a bad year. Lost a lot of people. Lost them how? Accidents. Drownings. People leaving town. Rick's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Just put the rod down, Jake. Please. Jake set his fishing rod on the dock but didn't pack it away. How many people died, Rick? I can't. How many? Rick looked around as if someone might Be listening, then stepped closer to the dock. 7. 7 people died in the lake that summer. All of them drowning, all of them experienced swimmers. Jesus. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. What kind of accidents? The kind that don't make sense. Tom Bradley was a high school swim coach. Found him floating face down in 3 feet of water. Mary Chen, Tom's aunt, she was training for a triathlon. They found her in the middle of the lake, no sign of what happened. Jake's mind raced. That's why Patricia banned fishing. She thought it was dangerous. Maybe. Rick glanced at the water again. Or maybe she knew something else. Like what? Before Rick could answer, both men heard it, a sound like singing, faint and distant, seeming to come from the water itself. They froze, listening, but the sound faded as quickly as it had begun. Did you hear that? Jake asked. Rick's face had gone white. I didn't hear anything. Rick, I didn't hear anything. Rick's voice cracked. Just pack up your gear and go inside, Jake. Don't come back to the water. He turned and walked quickly back to his patrol car, leaving Jake standing on the dock with more questions than answers. 7 people dead in one summer. All experienced swimmers. All drowning in a lake that Jake had swum in countless times without incident. Jake packed his equipment but didn't go inside. Instead, he walked along the shoreline, studying the exposed lake bed. The water was definitely lower than it had been even a week ago, and strange patterns were visible in the dried mud, swirling. Designs that looked almost deliberate. He was examining what looked like a symbol carved into the dried clay when his phone buzzed. A text from Tom Chen, found something. Can you video call? Jake walked back to the house and opened his laptop. Tom's face appeared on the screen, but he looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept. Jake, I've been up all night going through archives. I found something about Blackwater Lake, but it's not good. What did you find? Tom held up a yellowed newspaper clipping. This is from the Philadelphia Inquirer, August 1987. Mysterious deaths plague Pennsylvania Lake Town. 7 people died in Blackwater Lake over the course of 6 weeks. Rick told me about the drownings. They weren't just drownings, Jake. Listen to this. Tom began reading from the article. Local residents report strange phenomena in the weeks leading up to the deaths. Witnesses describe unusual lights in the water, strange sounds at night, and dramatic changes in fish behavior. Several residents claim to have seen large shapes moving beneath the surface. Jake felt his stomach drop. What kind of shapes? The article doesn't say. But here's the weird part, the story just stops. No follow-up articles, no investigation, no resolution. It's like the whole thing was just forgotten. Or covered up. That's what I'm thinking. But Jake, there's more. I found records of similar incidents going back over a century. Every 20 to 30 years, there's a cluster of deaths on Blackwater Lake. Always the same pattern, drownings, strange phenomena, then silence. Jake stared at the screen, his mind reeling. How far back do the records go? 1892, that's the first documented incident. 5 people died that summer. Then 1923, 4 deaths. 1954, 6 deaths. 1987, 7 deaths. That's about every 30 years. Give or take. Jake, I think something is living in that lake. Something that becomes active periodically. Jake looked out his window at the dark water. The lake level is dropping. I've never seen it this low. Tom's expression grew more serious. What if that's what triggers it? What if whatever's down there needs the water level to drop before it can hunt? You're talking about some kind of monster. I'm talking about explaining 7 unexplained deaths and a 100-year pattern of similar incidents. Jake, you need to get away from that lake. Jake was about to respond when he noticed something outside. The water wasn't just lower, it was still dropping. As he watched, more of the lake bed became exposed, revealing shapes that definitely weren't natural. Tom, I have to go. Jake, don't. Jake closed the laptop and grabbed his jacket. He needed to see what was being revealed as the water receded. He needed to understand what Patricia Kellerman had been protecting the town from for 30 years. The walk to the water's edge took longer now. The shoreline had moved back almost 10 feet, exposing an area that Jake had never seen dry. The mud was dark and rich, filled with strange depressions and patterns that looked almost like writing, but it was the bones that made him stop breathing. They jutted up from the exposed lakebed like broken branches, white and weathered, but unmistakably human. Jake counted at least a dozen skull fragments, along with what looked like complete skeletons partially buried in the mud, and they were old. Very old. These weren't the remains of the 1987 victims or any recent deaths. These bones had been in the lake for decades, maybe centuries. Jake pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. Whatever was happening, whatever Patricia had been covering up, this was evidence. This was proof that Blackwater Lake had been claiming lives for much longer than anyone had admitted. He was photographing what looked like a child's skull when he heard the sound again, that haunting song, closer now and more distinct. It seemed to be coming from the deeper water, from the parts of the lake that were still submerged. Jake looked up from his phone and felt his blood turn to ice. The water was moving. Not flowing or rippling, but moving in a way that suggested something large was passing just beneath the surface. The movement was heading straight. Jake drove into Millbrook with his phone full of bone photos and a head full of fury. The small town looked deceptively peaceful in the afternoon light, white clapboard houses with neat gardens, a main street lined with family-owned shops, and the kind of small-town charm that attracted weekend tourists from Philadelphia and New York. But Jake saw it differently now. Every resident he passed on the sidewalk, every shopkeeper waving from their doorway, how many of them knew? How many were complicit in a century-long cover-up that had cost dozens of lives? The township building sat at the end of Main Street, a brick structure that had been the town hall since 1923. Jake parked directly in front, not bothering with the visitor spaces, and stormed through the front doors. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Helen Price, looked up from her computer with a startled expression. "Jake Morrison. My goodness, I haven't seen you since." "Where's Patricia?" "The mayor. She's in a meeting with." Jake was already walking past her desk toward the hallway that led to the mayor's office. "Jake, you can't just." He pushed through. The door marked Mayor Patricia Kellerman without knocking. Patricia was seated behind her desk, but she wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit sat across from her, mid-50s, with silver hair and the kind of authority that came from federal employment. Both looked up as Jake entered, and Patricia's face went pale. The man in the suit reached into his jacket with practiced ease. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia said, her voice carefully controlled. "This is a private meeting." "I bet it is." Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photos of the bones. "Want to explain these?" Patricia's composure cracked. "How did you? The water level shouldn't be what? Low enough to expose your little graveyard." The man in the suit stood up, his hand still inside his jacket. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Agent David Crenshaw with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You need to leave this office immediately." Jake laughed bitterly. "Fish and wildlife? That's rich. What kind of fish leaves human bones scattered across a lakebed?" "Agent." Crenshaw's eyes narrowed. "You've been taking photographs of a protected habitat without authorization. That's a federal crime." "Protected habitat for what?" "Entity BL-1. The effect was immediate. Patricia gasped, and Agent Crenshaw's hand moved to what Jake now realized was a weapon. "How do you know that designation?" Crenshaw demanded. "I know a lot of things. I know 7 people died in 1987. I know similar deaths have been happening every 30 years for over a century. I know my grandfather was part of your cover-up." Jake's voice rose with each word. "And I know something is living in that lake. Something you've been feeding people to for generations." "That's enough," Crenshaw said, but Patricia held up a hand. "No, David. He deserves to know. His family." She trailed off, looking older than her 62 years. "Sit down, Jake. Please." Jake remained standing. "I'm not interested in your excuses." "Then you're interested in the truth." Patricia opened a desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Because the truth is more complicated than you think. She spread several photographs across her desk. Black and white images that looked like they'd been taken decades ago. Jake stepped closer despite himself. The first photo showed Blackwater Lake in what appeared to be the 1950s. The image was grainy, but Jake could make out something in the water, a dark shape that was definitely not a fish or any known aquatic animal. It was massive, easily 30 feet long, with what looked like multiple limbs or appendages. This was taken in 1954, Patricia said quietly. The year your grandfather first encountered it. Jake stared at the image. What is it? We don't know. Agent Crenshaw said. Not exactly. The creature appears to be prehistoric, possibly a survivor from the last ice age. It's been living in the deep parts of Blackwater Lake for thousands of years. Creature? Jake's voice cracked slightly. You're talking about some kind of monster. We are talking about a species that predates human civilization, Patricia said. Something that has learned to coexist with human settlement, but on its own terms. She showed him another photo, this one from 1987. The image was clearer, taken with better equipment. Jake could see the thing's head breaking the surface, elongated and serpentine, with rows of teeth and eyes that seemed to glow even in the black and white photograph. It feeds every 25 to 30 years, Patricia continued. The feeding cycle coincides with certain environmental conditions, water temperature, oxygen levels, lunar cycles. We don't fully understand the mechanism, but we know the pattern. And you just let it happen. Jake's hands were shaking. You let it kill people. We tried to stop it, Agent Crenshaw said. In 1954, the government sent a team to eliminate the creature. Military divers, explosives, everything we could think of. We lost 12 men, and the creature barely seemed affected. Patricia opened the folder wider, revealing more documents. Your grandfather was part of that team, Jake. He was a Navy diver during the war, and the government recruited him to help with the operation. Jake felt the world tilt around him. He tried to kill it. He tried to save lives, Patricia said firmly. When the military operation failed, your grandfather made a deal with the creature. A deal. The creature is intelligent, Jake. Not human intelligent, but smart enough to communicate, to understand cause and effect. Your grandfather negotiated a truce. Agent Crenshaw pulled out a yellow document covered in official seals. The Morrison Accord, signed in 1955. In exchange for being left alone, the creature would limit its feeding to specific intervals and specific numbers. No more than 7 people every 30 years. Jake stared at the document in horror. My grandfather agreed to let it kill people. He agreed to save hundreds of lives, Patricia said. Before the accord, the creature fed whenever it was hungry. Sometimes it would take 20 people in a single summer. The deal reduced the casualties by 90%. But it didn't stop them entirely. No, Patricia said quietly. It didn't. Jake sank into the chair across from Patricia's desk, his mind reeling. The fishing ban. That's how you control who gets taken. The creature feeds on people who spend significant time in the water, Agent Crenshaw explained. Swimmers, divers, fishermen. By limiting access to the lake, we can usually ensure that the only people who die are what? Patricia looked uncomfortable. Volunteers. People who are terminally ill, who have nothing left to lose. People who want to make their deaths count for something. Jesus Christ. Jake put his head in his hands. You're talking about human sacrifice. We are talking about saving lives, Agent Crenshaw said sharply. The creature has to feed. That's not negotiable. Our only choice is how many people die. Jake looked up at them. What happens if it doesn't get fed? Patricia and Agent Crenshaw exchanged glances. We've never tested that, Patricia said. But the creature communicates its needs clearly. When it's hungry, the water level drops. When it's ready to feed, the temperature changes. We've always provided what it needs. Until now. What do you mean? Jake pulled out his phone and showed them the photos from that morning. Look at the water level. It's lower than it's been in decades. And it's still dropping. Agent Crenshaw studied the images, his face growing pale. This is impossible. The next feeding cycle isn't due for another 12 years. Then why is it waking up? Patricia stood up abruptly and walked to the window that overlooked Main Street. There's something we haven't told you. Something that happened in 1987. What? The creature was supposed to take 7 people that summer. But it took 8. Jake felt cold dread settling in his stomach. Who was the 8th? Your father. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His father had died in 1987, but not in the lake. He died in a car accident on Route 15, driving home from work. Jake had been 12 years old. That's impossible, Jake whispered. My father died in a car crash. Your father was the 8th victim, Patricia said, not turning from the window. The creature took him 3 days after the cycle should have ended. We don't know why. But the car accident was staged, Agent Crenshaw said quietly. We couldn't have people asking questions about why David Morrison was found drowned in his car on dry land. The official story was that he lost control of the vehicle and crashed into the lake. Jake's vision blurred. Everything he'd known about his father's death was a lie. Why? Why did it take him? We think your father was trying to break the accord, Patricia said. He'd been asking questions, doing research. He found some of the older records, the ones from before the government involvement. He was planning to expose everything. So you let that thing kill him? We didn't let anything happen, Agent Crenshaw said firmly. The creature acted on its own. It saw your father as a threat to the arrangement. Jake stood up slowly, his entire body shaking with rage. You've been lying to me my whole life. My grandfather, my father, the whole goddamn town. Jake, please, no. Jake backed toward the door. You've been feeding people to a monster for 70 years and you think that's acceptable. It's the only way to keep it contained, Patricia said desperately. If we don't maintain the accord, if we don't manage the feeding cycles, the creature will hunt freely. Dozens of people will die. Maybe it's time to find another solution. Agent Crenshaw's hand moved back toward his weapon. Mr. Morrison, you need to understand the consequences of what you're suggesting. Jake sat in his truck at the end of his driveway, staring at the house that had been in his family for 4 generations. The structure looked different now, not like a home, but like a watchtower. A place where his grandfather had stood guard over a terrible secret, where his father had died trying to expose the truth. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In 30 minutes it would be dark, and Jake would learn exactly what his family had been protecting the town from for 70 years. He pulled out his phone and called Tom Chen. Jake, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Where are you? At the house. Tom, I need you to do something for me. I need you to contact the FBI, the state police, anyone who will listen. Tell them about Blackwater Lake, about the creature, about the cover-up. Jake, slow down. What creature? Jake spent the next 10 minutes telling Tom everything, the Morrison Accord, his father's real death, the century-long feeding cycle. Tom listened in stunned silence. Jesus Christ, Jake. You're talking about something out of a horror movie. I'm talking about something that's been murdering people for generations while the government covered it up. Jake got out of his truck and walked toward the house. I'm going to end it tonight. How? I don't know yet. But I'm not going to let it kill anyone else. Jake, you can't fight some prehistoric monster by yourself. You need help. I tried. Help. Help has been feeding people to this thing for 70 years. Jake reached his front door and paused. Tom, if something happens to me tonight, make sure the world knows the truth. Make sure Patricia Kellerman and Agent Crenshaw answer for what they've done. Jake, don't. Jake hung up and entered the house. The familiar rooms felt foreign now, tainted by the knowledge of what his family had been part of. He walked through the kitchen, past the living room where he'd spent countless hours with his grandfather, and into the study. The study had been His grandfather's domain, walls lined with books, a heavy oak desk, and a gun cabinet that Jake had never seen opened. Now he wondered what else his grandfather had hidden from him. Jake started with the desk drawers. The first contained typical office supplies, but the second held something unexpected, a leather journal with W. Morrison embossed on the cover. His grandfather's handwriting filled the pages, documenting decades of observations about the lake and its inhabitant. June 15, 1955, the creature accepted the terms. 7 lives every 30 years in exchange for leaving the town alone. God help me, I've negotiated with a demon. August 3, 1961, the lake temperature dropped 5 degrees overnight. It's getting ready to feed. I've identified 3 volunteers, all terminal cancer patients from the county hospital. They understand what they are sacrificing themselves for. September 12, 1961, it's done. The creature took Thompson, Martinez, and Kelly. Clean kills, no suffering. The water temperature has returned to normal. We have 29 years of peace. Jake flipped through the pages, his horror growing with each entry. His grandfather had been the architect of the feeding system, carefully selecting victims and timing their deaths to satisfy the creature's needs. May 4, 1987, David is asking questions. He found some of the old records, the ones from before the government got involved. I tried to explain the necessity of what we do, but he won't listen. He says he's going to expose everything. May 7, 1987, I told Patricia about David's plans. She contacted the federal agents. They say they can handle it, but I'm worried. The creature doesn't like disruption. May 10, 1987, David is dead. The creature took him 3 days after the feeding. Cycle ended. It knew he was a threat. I've lost my son to protect this town, and I don't know if I can live with that. Jake's hands were shaking as he read the final entries. His grandfather had known the creature would kill his father, and he'd done nothing to stop it. May 15, 1987, Jake is asking about his father's death. I told him it was a car accident, same as everyone else. He's only 12. Maybe by the time he's old enough to understand, we'll have found another way. December 24, 1999, Jake is home from college. He still believes his father died in a car crash. I want to tell him the truth, but what purpose would it serve? The secret dies with me. But the secret hadn't died with his grandfather. It had been passed to Patricia Kellerman, to Agent Crenshaw, to a network of people who had decided that some lives were worth more than others. Jake closed the journal and opened the gun cabinet. Inside, he found his grandfather's hunting rifle. Along with something unexpected, a waterproof case containing what looked like military equipment. Diving gear, underwater lights, and several devices Jake didn't recognize. A note was taped to the inside of the case, for Jake, in case the creature breaks the accord. Your grandfather believed you would be the one to finish what he started. The equipment is experimental, designed to work underwater. Use it wisely. Jake stared at the note, signed with his grandfather's familiar handwriting. Even in death, the old man had been preparing for this moment. Jake loaded the rifle and gathered the diving equipment. As he worked, he noticed something strange. The house was completely silent. No hum from the refrigerator, no ticking from the grandfather clock in the hallway. He checked his phone and found no signal. Outside, the lake was beginning to glow. Jake walked to the window and felt his breath catch. The water was luminescent, pulsing with an eerie blue-green light that seemed to emanate from the depths. As he watched, the light grew brighter, and the surface of the lake began to churn. Something was rising. Jake grabbed the rifle and diving equipment and ran outside. The night air was warm, unnaturally warm for October, and it smelled of ozone and decay. The lake's glow was bright enough to read by, and Jake could see the water level dropping even faster than before. More bones were exposed now, not just human remains, but the skeletons of animals, some that Jake didn't recognize. The creature had been feeding on more than just people. A sound echoed across the water, a deep, resonant call that seemed to vibrate in Jake's chest. It was answered by another call, then another. Jake realized with growing horror that there wasn't just one creature in the lake. There were several. As if summoned by his thoughts, the first creature broke the surface. Jake had seen the photographs, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality. The thing was massive, easily 40 feet long, with a serpentine body, covered in scales that reflected the lake's glow. Its head was elongated and predatory, with rows of teeth that gleamed like ivory daggers. But it was the eyes that terrified Jake the most. They were intelligent, ancient, and filled with a hunger that had been building for decades. The creature's gaze fixed on Jake, and he heard something impossible, a voice in his head, speaking in accented English. "Morrison, you have your grandfather's smell." Jake raised the rifle, his hands steady despite his terror. "You killed my father. Your father would have broken the accord. He would have brought hunters, soldiers, chaos. I preserved the peace by murdering him, by protecting the balance. Your grandfather understood. The few die so the many may live." A second creature surfaced, smaller than the first but no less menacing. Then a third. Jake realized he was facing an entire family of these things, a breeding population that had been hiding in the deep parts of Blackwater Lake for centuries. "You will not break the accord," the first creature continued. "You will select the 7, as your grandfather did. As your father should have done." "No," Jake said firmly. "I'm ending this tonight." The creature's laugh was like rocks grinding together. "You think your small weapon can harm us? We have survived ice ages, droughts, the rise and fall of civilizations. We are eternal." "Maybe," Jake said, shouldering the rifle. "But you're not bulletproof." He fired at the creature's head, the shot echoing across the water. The bullet struck the thing's skull but bounced off harmlessly, leaving only a small scratch on the armored scales. The creature's amusement was palpable. "Your grandfather tried the same thing in 1954. The military tried explosives, harpoons, poison. We are not so easily killed." Jake lowered the rifle, his mind racing. If conventional weapons couldn't hurt them, what could? He thought about the equipment in the waterproof case, the devices he didn't recognize. "Choose the 7, the creature demanded. "The feeding must begin before dawn, or we will hunt freely. The entire town will become our prey." "I won't choose anyone," Jake said. "Find another way to feed." "There is no other way. We have tried fish, animals, even plants. Only human flesh sustains us. Only human blood gives us strength." The creatures began moving toward shore, their massive bodies creating waves that lapped at Jake's feet. He backed away, still carrying the rifle, and felt his heel hit something hard. One of the experimental devices from his grandfather's case had fallen out. Jake picked it up and realized it was some kind of sonar device designed to work underwater. A military designation was stenciled on the side, Sonic Disruptor, prototype. The first creature was only 20 feet from shore now, its head raised above the water like a prehistoric nightmare. "You have 10 minutes to choose the 7, Morrison. After that, we hunt." Jake looked at the device in his hands, then at the approaching creatures. His grandfather had been preparing for this moment for decades, leaving behind equipment that might actually be able to hurt them. But to use it, Jake W.